Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share the Zoom link with our excellent guest. He has been notified. And so today I'm going to be drinking another glass of rooibos, and Connor will be bringing a hot beverage of his own, which is very exciting. It looks particularly beautiful out here today in Auckland. The clouds are stunning. Sky is very beautiful. You see it very prettily reflected in the screen. I have been on a very rapid essay writing binge, and that I have 10,000 words due tomorrow of various essays. But I thought having a break to chat about training would be a very nice thing to do with my Friday afternoon. I might get some of the just administrative chat out of the way before Connor arrives. Tonight there is no ordinary club night, but there is the Horton Cup final. So that will be incredibly exciting, and I encourage you all to go along to the Auckland Facebook page and watch that. 6 of the top novices who've been training with Auckland and have been performing consistently throughout the club night process have been asked back to take place in a debate. We've had a very rousing discussion between the exec as to what exactly we're going to set as the motion, but I'm sure it will not disappoint. So if you're keen to look at some of the things that we've been talking about in practice, I know that a lot of those speakers have been very closely following this particular show to make sure they're up to date on all of the cool new tricks that debaters are using. I have now become aware that the sky exactly above me is very dark. So I'm hoping it does not start to rain terribly. It would be very embarrassing when we have a guest. Our flat has not been given a little balcony roof yet. They're slowly inserting them on all of the different flats in our compound. Obviously that was slowed down significantly with COVID, but hopefully we have a hat relatively soon, because doing these development centers through the wet side of winter will be very unpleasant. Oh, let's see if anyone has joined. Hello, Connor. So I cannot hear you for some reason, and I'm wondering why that is. Are you muted or am I muted?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Perfect.
Beauty. I think it's my headphones. How you going?
Yeah. Good. So I was just telling everyone that the weather in the last 30 seconds has rather scarily transformed. So hoping strongly that it doesn't suddenly become a deluge while we're discussing, because I have nothing between me and the sky. How has you are at work at the moment, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Sneaking up for 30 minutes, which is good.
Have they allowed you to go physically back to work, or are you just working from home?
Just from home. Yeah.
Okay.
So
very easy for you to sneak out of work for a bit.
Exactly right. Just lucky.
So, a few people from New Zealand, because a lot of New Zealanders won't know who you are. So just give yourself a brief introduction, and then we can dive into some chat.
Cool. Yeah. So my name's Connor. I am an honours student at Melbourne Uni. So I've been debating for the past 3 years for the University of Melbourne. I am the DCA of Worlds coming up this year, pre-Worlds, and I was the Australs Best Speaker and winner last year. So I've got a bit of experience in both 3 and 3 MVP, but just, happy to be here and to chat through some third speaker tips.
Yeah, so we're specifically, I'm going to be focusing on Australs, because obviously that's what's coming up. And straight after Australs, we've had to delay our big national 3-on-3 competition. So that's taking place, I think, 2 weeks after Australs. So a lot of people who aren't coming along to Australs will also be interested in tips for the 3-on-3 in that sense. So I just want to have a general discussion of what are the things that you did to help prepare for Australs. How did you approach the few weeks going up to it? And then once you were there, what were the things that you did to just put yourself in the mindset of being able to do well at a tournament?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that you got to do in the lead up, which is just it's pretty easy at the moment given online tournaments, but is to have some tournament prep with your team. I think I was really lucky that last year we had a great team dynamic that, the team had debated together before, that we were really into it and understood how we worked, but particularly for a team that's younger or newer, you need to get an idea of how people think and what their strengths and weaknesses are and what the team needs to work on. So I think that's a really good start. I think additionally particularly for pre-Australs tournaments, it's really important to take a developmental mindset and focus. I think the thing I always thought at least was if you're winning, it's almost a bad thing because you're not going to be taking the insights out of it that you really want to. Because you almost need the shock of, okay, we lost by a point, how can we improve this, rather than the complacency of winning by a point or two and thinking that those kind of holes are okay. So I think it's really important to take that mindset of looking and being really critical in the lead up. So I think it's like once you do that and you really focus on what are my exact skills, really following up with adjudicators and figuring out what the weaknesses are, what you need to work on, then you have more trust in the system when you're actually at Australs. I think, to be honest, given the intensity of the tournament, it's really hard to make too many tweaks while you're there. So it's much better to have that time for development beforehand. I think the other thing that's
raining very heavily for me.
Rained on. Maybe good to move. I'll pause.
I've just handed you to Joe, who is a DCA of Australs.
Hi.
Hey, Joe.
Saving Daniel as
he escapes the cold.
Yeah.
As the premise of the show is undermined.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, cannot spend an afternoon chatting on the balcony because it has decided to rain. So you lost, you were saying, quite a few debates in the lead up to Australs, even though you obviously did very well at Australs. How did you cope with those setbacks?
Yeah, so it's obviously not easy. So we didn't break at a couple of tournaments leading up to it. And then we obviously had a very successful run. I think it's about not getting too despondent and then taking lessons out of it. Like, you really got to know what you're there for. And particularly for pre-Australs tournaments, they really don't have a significant bearing on how Australs is going to happen. It's a pretty big tournament. No one's going to really know who you are, regardless of which team you are. Like, you might have some recognition as a team, but you'll have a lot of badges who have never seen you before. And so it's about working on those skills. So I think for us, it was like hard because, losing debates and not breaking is never easy. But it was just the fact that we had our expectations managed, that we were going in there saying we're going to debate as well as we can and learn as much as we can, but the results aren't going to matter either way. So I think that's the only thing you can do. Because obviously it's normal at Australs itself to be stressed about results, but it's also good to train the brain to remember that debates are independent events, that there's no reason why a debate from the last round should affect your performance at all in this round. There can be different motions, different teams, different environment. But often I think psychologically people get into a death spiral or get too complacent and then have a shocking few rounds to end a tournament. So I think it's also good for that, just to kind of learn how to separate yourself from the results and focus on the process instead.
So obviously, when you get to the tournament, and those prep tournaments you do as a team are incredibly important. What I struggled with, particularly I'm speaking third at this Australs, is that a lot of the practice that I used to do was just honing particular skills, either as a first speaker, as a second speaker. And I found that quite easy to just do by myself or to record it and send it to someone else. But obviously things are a little bit different when you're a third speaker, and a lot of what you're adding to the debate is so debate specific. So you and I ended up having a conversation where you recommended some things that I actually found very useful in terms of ginning up my preparation. So what were the types of individual things that you did before Australs to help prepare yourself for speaking?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think that there's a lot of mystery surrounding response positions, particularly third speaker, and also with MVP. I think the first thing, and I think we discussed this briefly, but it's definitely a mindset situation where you have to break up what the third speech is actually what you're trying to do and what the skills are. Because I think at first you just, need to speak well, you need to be efficient, so not use too many words relative to the time you have, and you need to have a good case, and that's relatively intuitive and clear, and you can drill that till the cows come home. But with third, there's a lot of different things you have to do. So you have to learn to process material quickly. So you're looking at, can I keep all these different arguments in my head and sort through them and figure out what's important or not? You then have this skill of, can I generate responses as quickly as possible? And then you have this skill of, how can I articulate everything I want to say to the adjudicator? Because I think it's a particularly big problem at third, where when you're reflecting on the debate so much, the disconnect between what you think you're saying and what people hear becomes quite significant. So I think that my strategy always was, well, what exact skills do I need to have? And how can I can I drill them effectively? How can I improve my skills in each of those regards? So a few of the ones I talked about in that conversation was for my cognition, just literally increasing my brain power. I'd often do no note speeches. So I would write my notes during the debate, and then at third speaker, I'd get up and I'd speak without notes for the whole 8 minutes. That seems pretty daunting, and it can be quite confronting when you first do it. But what it forces you to do is to basically think through all your key talking points, think through exactly how you're going to structure what you're going to say and why you're doing that. Because when you have notes, you just kind of rely on the paper. But when you're free from that, you have to actually form a narrative. You have to have some sort of path to explain to the adjudicator. That's something I talk about a lot when I'm teaching people third, is that the third speech is very late in the debate. You're not just wanting to add bulk responses in a scattergun manner. You're trying to articulate why your team is winning and will win the debate. And that has to have a general narrative, a general thread, a general approach. So that's one way you can really hone that. And that also helps you to speed up the mind, because when you have notes, suddenly everything feels like it's going much slower and you have more time to think about it. I think additionally, I did a lot of what's called rebuttal tennis. So that would just be getting someone to give me an argument for a minute, or potentially watching one online, having seen the topic like 30 seconds before, and just think of every single response I can give in a minute and just say all of them. And then I'd go afterwards, okay, how many could I think of? Is there any more I could have thought of? And which ones are good and bad and why? Because I think often people get really kind of tentative and try to think of the very best response every time. But sometimes you just need to kind of be quite creative, let your brain think of every possible response and then kind of sort through them and go, oh yeah, that's a really damaging response. That's not a damaging response. I think the final thing is that I recognize that at third in particular, there's been a trend towards trying to have really clever or clear strategic intros, and to really hit with those intros in particular and to deliver that material fluently. So I do a lot of voice recordings, introductions, and listen to them myself, because I think that while everyone hates listening to themselves, if you know exactly what you sound like, you can change it a bit. You can be like, oh, I need to be louder there and softer there. I need to be clearer there. I need to remove those words. And it really improves your improvement arc, because you understand why you're being given the feedback. That's another thing I did as well. I recorded all my speeches and I'd actually listen to them after I received feedback, because then I could situate the feedback within what I thought of my speech and realize the disconnect. Because often people don't absorb feedback because they just don't realize why it applies to them or how to apply it. But when you listen back to your speech, often that really helps. So those are a few things. There are many more ways to do it. I think that's the general idea, is isolating what are my strengths and weaknesses as a third speaker. What do I really need to work on? I knew for me it was a bit messy. I rarely had a clear thread, and I would undergenerate responses in comparison to a lot of teams. And also I just kind of really focused on those skills to sound more fluent and to generate more responses.
I like what you said there about the introductions. One thing that I like to do is after a debate, where obviously re-giving a whole speech, there's a diminishing return there of the inability to hold all of those improvements in your head at the same time and trying to implement them when you do a new speech, and you often fall into the same poor routines. But I found redoing introductions in decreasing amounts of time to be a very useful thing, not only for the fluency we're discussing, but also for that strategic mindset of what do I need to do to win the debate? How do I win that? And I think that's often one of the reasons why I've been wary to speak in third, because I liked just being able to do things without necessarily having to have that overall strategy in my head. And obviously, I think that's hurt me throughout the years. And I think just as throughout my career, I've just teased up quite a bit my ability to see that overall strategic thinking, and it makes such a big difference within the way you speak. So what I've noticed often from the way that you set up your introductions, it often seems to hinge on an unrebutted bit of analysis or an unrebutted mechanism or something big that you are adding to the debate. Do you consciously try and pick out one big thing to achieve in your introduction as being meaningful, or do you try and give like a roadmap to the debate?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that tip is fantastic regarding introductions. The second thing is absolutely what I tend to do is you want to also be critical of your own case and evaluate, well, what do we have on the table? Because there are many ways you can win a debate. Like, for instance, if there are two practical clashes and a principle clash, you have to make choices. And I think I'm pretty risk averse. Normally I'll choose the tack where I think that so for instance, I might be like, okay, we have some practical benefit. If we prove this benefit, we're not going to lose the debate. So I'm just going to spend a minute really concretizing the benefit, really like emphasizing it hasn't been rebutted and it can't really be genuinely rebutted at third neg, given the detail of it, whatever it may be, and then highlighting why it's strategically important. So yeah, I think it depends on the debate. I think sometimes you need to go, okay, we've got something that's unrebutted, I need to highlight that. Whereas sometimes I might go, right, we've got plenty of benefits, we're winning the debate, but there's this really dangerous piece of material on neg that I'm afraid of. I think it can beat us. So then I'll spend the introduction explaining why it's untrue. Yeah. And then the implications. So I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, is that you could do a 15-minute speech and do all of these things, but it really depends on what case you're coming up against. And so the answer is, yeah, I very deliberately, my introductions will choose that path, and I'll be assessing, particularly by second nave on third AF, okay, do they have material that's really going to hurt us, or is it mostly mitigatory and fringe? What material do we have? How much rebuilding do I need to do? Can I just rack up margins at this point, or am I really needing to restore mechanisms, or do I need to impact something? Because sometimes you might have a really well-proven mechanism, but no one cares about it. And so at that point, I'm like, okay, I need to hammer home why this matters. Or sometimes it might be like, we haven't proven the thing and I need to fill in a gap by flipping a mechanism from side negative, or re-raising a mechanism we've given in the first speech and developing it, or whatever it may be. That's usually the best way to go about it, I think, just to be flexible with which opposition you're facing, because you can present the best case you possibly can every time, but the exact rebuttal will always change because you're coming up against different material, and that material will involve different trade-offs in rebuttal, different trade-offs in what stuff you emphasize and what stuff you don't. And so that's something that the intro is really good for.
Yeah, I really like that you've articulated there kind of like a killer instinct, or looking at the turning points in the debate, what is necessary for you to win. But I actually want to focus on something else you mentioned, and that was the idea of widening margins. Can you explain how you use that in like clear debates? So obviously debates where you want to increase your margin within the debates, but how is it useful also for winning debates that might be a little bit closer, where it's really won on those margins?
Yeah, I think it's really important, because if you're within, the way I always saw it at least, is that if the debate's within 2 or 3 points, you really have no right to win it, because it means that the other team has material that's damaging that can beat you plausibly. And so you can't ensure the adjudicator is going to give the debate to you. So the best way to make debates clear and to increase your consistency and to stop getting, robbed, is just to make the debates 5-point margins rather than 2-point margins. And that really cleans it up. I think, again, it's somewhat debate dependent, but I think the first thing I would do to rack up a margin is really, I take one of two more aggressive strategies. So either I would spend the first minute just really making sure that everything we've said is proven. So if I know that everything's proven, I know it's all weighed, and then spend all my rebuttal just decimating their team. So just going through and rebutting everything I physically can. So I take more of a scattergun approach in that context, if I was confident the material was shored up. And that's the way I'd go about it. So in that way, you just go, and what you do is you just constantly, even if you go, I want to rebut this argument, even if it's true, this argument, even if it's true, this argument, even if it's true, this argument, and then you just use all the skills, you do the impacting, you do the plausibility analysis. That's how you rack up a margin, because I think judges often, even if you win on the biggest harm, if they think there are benefits on the other team, or if they think there are scenarios where the other team wins, they're likely to shrink those margins. But if you can layer your analysis and be like, there are 3 plausible worlds for side negative, or there are 4 different categories of harm, I'm going to rebut every single one of them, then they're in trouble. I think the flip side is that I'm not particularly sure about our benefits, but I know their case is nonsense. What I'll do is I'll spend the first 2 minutes just basically saying that, like, here is exactly why their material is wrong, nonsense, not impactful. And then just try to cut in with a few bits of important strategic commentary. That might be because there's a problem solution gap in their case, or they haven't actually impacted an argument or proven it at all, and it's too late in the debate to do so. And then I'll spend the 6 minutes going, so given they have nothing, what did they say to us? And spend time repairing. So I think that's one thing that's really useful, is you need to differentiate between, am I defending and rebuilding my case, or am I aggressively undercutting theirs? And often people miss out on racking up margins because they are like, oh, we're winning, we're beating their arms, let's just keep bashing their arms, rather than spending time expanding upon improving your benefits and really trying to recharacterize them and show why they're true in many situations. Or the inverse, being like, we've got some great benefits, but just ignoring the material on their side that could be pretty good, that actually could threaten you. So that's something that's really important to it, is it's taking away the ego from it and being like, okay, is what we've said actually any good? Is what they've said actually any good? And I'm going to prioritize making sure that we win in the most possible scenarios, because that's what's going to make sure that we win the debate and we win it clearly.
One thing I think I've found helpful in the way that I think about and approach debates is, firstly, you got to figure out how the opposition wins the debate. And that involves being quite generous to the opposition's arguments, going through like trying to just treat them, okay, what is the best possible analysis of these arguments? And then really setting that conception of their speeches up within your debate as something to respond to. Because very often you'll have speakers who are excellent at winning a debate, just getting to the end consequence, but then never really able to extract anything out of the debate. And obviously, if the debate is close, there's the variability of the judge that gets in. And it really what you're talking there about increasing the way they see the debate, increasing the way that judges see those margins within the debate probably has a big impact on whether you win those 50-50 calls.
Yeah, I think one additional thing to say there, because I think it just triggered that thought when you mentioned that, is that often it's when you have those kind of debates where you're convinced you've won and then you walk in and you lose and you have like a white ashen face. Often that's because, in my experience at least, it's a characterization problem. It's that you've had some extreme characterization of the debate, which is slightly implausible or could possibly be true, but doesn't actually match all scenarios. So I think that that's an example of where it can be good to do that, to give their best vision, but also give their best vision in a world that so just be like, for instance, in a debate about US foreign policy, just be like, well, let's just assume that the US is a somewhat benevolent actor, because often it's really easy to prove the US is not a benevolent actor. It's awful, but you can actually, even if you prove that, it's like, but even if it is, here are 3 reasons why it's still a bad idea to intervene in this situation. That's when you don't lose, because the judge can be like, I didn't buy your characterization, but you still proved it was correct even if it wasn't. Where I think teams get caught up because they either don't actually substantiate the assumption, so they don't give a reason structurally as to why the US is not a benevolent actor, or they do, but the adjudicator misses them, or the other team has a forceful alternative as well, and counter reasons that aren't rebutted fully. So that's a really good test as well, saying, do my arguments in any way rely upon a particular characterization of an actor? If they do, let's find ways to make those arguments not rely on that characterization, or let's make sure that characterization is really robust so people can't question it and critique it and reject it overall.
So obviously when you go to somewhere like Australs, there's probably like much more of a diversity of ways of debating or ways of judging debates than you'd normally experience in your domestic circuits. Did you ever shift up the way that you spoke depending on who was judging you or what you want to achieve? Or do you think you really were able to identify there's something that works in most cases and then just doing those basics really well?
Yeah, so I tended not to, actually. I think that the way I think about it is, what are some skills that are emphasized across all circuits? So I think this is something I thought about more at Worlds, but I think that, for instance, like the European circuit is far more
with BP as well.
Yeah, with BP. With like weighing, and they're really into weighing and principles and these sorts of things, where the Australian circuit in particular is far more mechanistic and very, very practically oriented. So I think that what I would do at least is just try to find a style that appeal to all formats. So, and the simple answer to that, it's an unfortunate answer, is just to do everything as well as you can, like not to have massive omissions. Explain what the argument is, explaining why it matters, explaining why it's true, explaining who it affects, how it affects them, and which scenarios it affects them. If you just tick everything off that list, everyone will find something they like about your team, and generally speaking, you'll be appealing across the board. And that's something I think that we were quite happy with as a team last year, is that across different circuits like New Zealand or Australia or Asia, and the various different circuits within Asia, we tended to win judges, because I think that that was the core of it. Like people appreciate debating, whether they can understand when you're winning or losing. It's just that you need to offer those components of debating to everyone, so people feel like you've done a good job.
Yeah, speaking of obviously the team aspect of debating, what were the things that you really, as a third speaker, what are the things you want from your first and second speaker? What do you push to them and ask them to prioritize to help you do well?
So I think like Grace and Stu both did this fantastically in different ways. I think for a first speaker, you want the mechs out. You want them to present the mechanisms for the argument, because you can always impact things. You can always weigh things that people rarely, if ever, say that's new. And that's something that Grace did phenomenally, and it's really, really important to get the mechs out, to get the context out, to get the characterization out, and then also did a terrific job at all the other steps of debating too, the impacting the weight. But the first thing you want is the mechanisms out, the things that make the argument true, because you can't add that at third. And the second, something Stu did phenomenally and is really important in those sorts of teams, is to rebut stuff. Like I think third just needs to rebut as much stuff as you can, because it makes, and to give a really wide range of responses, lots of layers, lots of different points that are hit, because at third, I see it less as giving new rebuttal and more as positioning existing rebuttal and reconstructing it to form a narrative or an explanation of why you win the debate. So the more rebuttal it's given, the more room you have to move. That being said, you don't want your second speaker contradicting material, which rarely ever happened in my team, thankfully. But you want lots of responses on the table, because then you can move them around. You have less work to do, because if your second speaker buts a case, then you've got more time to rack up margins or to defend your own material or to add new responses to the next speaker. So that's what I really looked for, I think. And that's why I think one of the reasons why our team did well is that we had that dynamic down pat, that the case always came out in a developed and clear manner at first, and then there was always damaging rebuttal at second. So I honestly felt like I had a much more relaxed job at times than other teams, because I could just sit there and think a lot more about these strategic questions, how to explain why we're winning, how to deal with the most dangerous points, rather than giving simple responses or having to fill in mechanisms. In our case, it was usually rounds out pretty well. So that's what I think is important in a team, for teams to know their roles, speakers to know their roles, and know that they have to execute that argumentation or have to give as many responses as they can, so that the third can wrap it up and the reply can come in and wrap it up as well.
I think one thing that's really apparent to me from that answer is that what your second speaker says plays a lot into your own speech. So obviously you have to be quite dynamic to what they do say. You need to find ways to integrate the material. You need to shift up your speech. How did you take notes when you were going to Australs? What is your note-taking style? Because that, for me, is one of the most difficult things of speaking second as opposed to speaking third, is having to make those big pivots halfway through a debate in terms of, okay, now I need to allocate my time strategically in this thing because the debate has shifted towards particular grounds. Did you go in with a particular idea of what you thought those strategic clashes are? How did you develop that and then write it in an efficient way?
So the way we went about it, at least, I think the first thing is that a lot of the drills really help. So one of the challenges is just remembering and tracking rebuttal. So doing no-note speeches and doing a lot of rebuttal tennis will just make that happen a lot quicker. The shorter you make those things happen, the more room you have to move. I think the thing we did is I would always have a copy myself written of the first speaker speech. So I knew what was coming out. I'd listen to it. I'd be like, oh, is anything different to what I expected? Note it down. And then I'd also be brainstorming questions in that period. So I'd be thinking, what is the new material we're dealing with, what do we need to handle, what is something I didn't think of in prep, all those sorts of things, and then organizing it around that. Then the big thing people don't do is they don't listen to their second speaker, which is a really silly thing to do, because if you want to track, so the thing I do is I track everything the other first speaker says, have it all down on a piece of paper and write all my initial notes, and then I'd be writing down the second speaker speech, Stu's speech, everything I heard, all the rest of rebuttal. And then I would also be going, okay, what did I not think of? What has been knocked out? Cross it all off. Then being like, what is it there additionally that I need to do? And I'd have like a list of responses at the end of it where I'd be like, okay, realistically, I've got 5 more responses to give. I've got two clear clashes I need to structure it around. I've got a general idea of what we're winning now, what we're losing. I'm going to start listening to the next speaker's speech and start structuring it. So I think the answer is you have to have coherent notes of every speech in the debate. You want to annotate your responses onto that speech in a different color. But then finally, I'd have different sheets for my own responses, but often they'd be quite sparse. So I would really script out my introductions. So I wanted to make sure they were as good as they could be. And
yeah, I think that's a big difference. People often put way too much. Like the thing is, often the mark is not just an introduction that doesn't get to everything, because people eventually get to them. But often your introduction will just balloon if you don't have any notes or like direction as to where you want to push it. And then it becomes a minute 30 and it's just deeply inefficient. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd always script that carefully, but I'd have quite sparse notes through the rest of it because I would be thinking about all the other responses. And because I kind of knew what they were, it was just having those kind of like keywords so I could remember it and think about that. So yeah, that's what I think. I think it's like you need to write every speech down. I would write detailed notes and subpoints. And if speakers didn't give subpoints, I'd give them subpoints because it's really important to know where the argument fits together. I'd think of as many responses as I could. So that's a rebuttal tennis part of it, the first neg, listen to my second speaker, cross out what they didn't present or additional ideas they gave me or things I want to whip. And then I'd start structuring my speech based on what I think I need to respond to, and then listen to that speaker before me, because a lot of people don't do that either. They forget to respond to things. And the final thing I do actually is in the last 2 minutes of my speech, I'd say, not just what do I need to respond to, but what could the third neg respond to me with? Because people forget that part too. And so you need to like do a few things, point out what they haven't responded to, add extra responses, think, okay, could they easily respond to this response? Is material flimsy? Can I, because you at that point of your third act, you want to overload third neg. You want to be such that they can't rebut everything and deal with what you've got. Because the third neg, you've got a lot more control. It's like, you know what's on the table, you can rebut what you have. So yeah, that's basically how I saw it. It's about keeping a script of every speech, having your own speech, and then crossing off the annotations or thoughts you have and finding a way to coordinate them into one coherent speech where you're only really making 2 or 3 claims. Like you're not making many claims, you're just trying to do all the kind of meta strategy stuff to win the debate.
Yeah. So obviously I think that approach is really nice if you're up against very good, very structured teams that you can follow very neatly. To what degree do you think that when you are trying to balance between listening and writing stuff down, that you're missing parts that potentially need to be responded to? And was there anything to do to ensure you got the best balance between listening to other people versus writing down your own stuff?
Yeah, so with, as you said, really structured speakers and really clear teams, you just do it in the signposting. So I listen to the initial signposting. Okay, that's like trigger word for me. I need to kind of go through, and you kind of get good eventually at figuring out what's filler and what's actually substantive material and new material. So that's the time I'd use. I'd also, this is a little bit cheeky, but I would make sure that my teammates and I would always, you walk up, lay your notes out, because that's some of the most valuable time that you have when your teammate. So if Stu was going up to speak, I would be using that time frantically to write responses, because that's like really valuable stuff. So, you don't take too long, but you do want to take your time, and you can take your time. Like I remember I took a long time in the Nostrils final to lay my notes out because I was thinking about where everything was, and I was using that time for myself to actually structure that. So that's a really valuable thing. If it's a really messy team, it's hard to follow. You got to prioritize mapping everything up, but then you also got to remember that it's going to be more about explaining why your conception of the debate is true and why theirs is false, because often the arguments won't rub up nicely against each other because they're going to say some things that are a bit wild. If it's an unstructured team or a slightly newer team, like a lot of the arguments can be quite left of center or quite unusual. So for me, it's always about explaining why that conception is wrong, knocking off the kind of fringe points, and then really robustly impacting and weighing our material. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I think never write notes unless you're confident you're not missing any material, but use the gaps between speeches. And that's to speak as well. So we usually only speak in between speeches unless it was urgent, because that's a really valuable thing to do, to not miss any material, and also to give an instruction on like, this is the most important issue or this is the most important issue, rather than doing it during the speeches.
Yeah, what I really like from that is that and I'm throughout these episodes, I've been a big proponent on not just being a good debater, but being a very good teammate. And I think it's something that's potentially underestimated in like obviously how we do trials, how we reward debaters, that having someone who you really trust to listen well, to be able to do some of that strategic thinking for you, can make a big difference in your debating. And if you're the person doing it, can obviously make a big difference to the success of your team. So I'm mindful that you have to run. Anything else you want to say to everyone? And if anyone has any questions, I don't think any questions have been left in the comments yet. But if anyone has any questions, they're welcome just to leave it in the comments and we can respond to it now.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, I think that's really true. I think I knew as well that like I'm again not great at generating responses. Was always, and my teammates knew I was good at the strategy stuff, so they had always passed me notes on extra responses or extra pushes, and I'd often incorporate that and use that as inspiration. But they also trusted me to do the strategy work, and that I was going to get up there and do the right thing. So I think it's another example of like. And likewise, I would often push responses up for the earlier stuff, like the kind of key strategic commentary stuff or the flat responses. That's another example, yeah, where the teamwork really helps. If you know, like, oh, look, I'm not that good at this, and someone else is willing to admit that as well, it's really great because you can cover each other's flaws in a way that you can't if everyone has their ego at the door. So I think that's a good point. Any other comments I was trying to think? I think one thing though, and this is critical about third, is that you want to use your first speaker skills if you've spoken there before. Like, remember how an argument's constructed, what logical proofs you need to make an argument clear or true, what you normally say at first neg can really affect how you do it at third neg as well, and what arguments how you're explaining arguments and stuff. The skills are mutually beneficial. And likewise, if you move from third to first, you're going to build more robust arguments because you're going to think about how a third speaker could rebut that argument. Rather than just delivering material because you think it's nice, you know?
Quick question on style. Obviously, you have quite a distinct style. Do you think you vary it depending on the needs of the debate, or have you found a rhythm that really works for you?
Yeah. I think my tendency is I often get a bit too fired up, and I don't think ideal. So I usually try to keep that one in check when I can. I think it depends on the debate. So like with debates which require more. Because some debates are like super mechanistic. So for an IR debate or an econ debate, I'm wanting to speak a little bit quicker and more in a more banal fashion and try to kind of adopt that like almost professorial style of like, this is why it's true. Because it's like the authority you gain comes from sounding like very informed and reasonable. Whereas in a social justice motion or a norms motion, you want to show that you understand an issue and that you want to change your manner, slow down more, do more impacting work, because that's what really matters. So I think it depends on the debate, but I would definitely consciously be like, that's something I'm going to vary and change. And also like speaker to speaker. So one of the best tips I got when I was younger is like, you don't want to sound the same as the previous speaker. So if one speaker has a massive go and gets really aggressive, then you want to be like, really kind of calm and distinguish yourself from that and kind of show like, oh, you know, and that team quite aggressively said this, you know, here are two responses, because it kind of shows you off to be more calm and controlled. And then if a team is really calm, you want to be like, and how dare this team, like, you know, just like detachedly say this. And like, that's the kind of style options you can use, because that's more subconscious. But again, like, while I like to make sure debates are like clear, when they get close, that stuff really matters, unfortunately. Like, people do get influenced by that kind of stuff. So being able to vary your manner, figure out what you need to change and do to adapt to the debate can be really useful.
In many ways, what we've been chatting about and the tips you've been giving kind of correspond with like a Platonic ideal of debating, where you're very you're quite generous to each other's arguments. You really try and go deeper on that analysis. But what you're saying there is more of that craft of debating, where it's looking at debating as like a human activity, being able to exploit some of those contrasts or some of those predictable tics that judges have. Were there any other like and anything else from the very like human side of debating and the fallibility of judges you made sure to use within debates, or to be aware that there are pitfalls that you needed to get around?
Yeah, so I think one thing that, like, for example, Arthur, who's another excellent debater from the LSE, who's debated in Melbourne as well with me, said, second speaker of World semi-finals, phenomenal debater, is you want to make memes, and that means that you want to brand an argument. You want to really carefully select the words you choose to describe an argument. Like, because if you just say flippant, it's not going to be that persuasive. But if you find a way to kind of get in the head of an adjudicator and think like, what are they going to use to describe this? And then describe it in that way, it's sticks in their head in a way that's really impactful. So I think we'd always choose titles of arguments really carefully. If I was rebutting an argument, I would, say that this team was like ungenerous in this situation, but I wouldn't just say ungenerous for the sake of it. It'd be like a really carefully selected word. So I think that kind of stuff is really useful because it sticks in the debate. I think additionally, that's also true of diagnosing flaws in a team's case. So if a team spends a lot of time from, hitting mechanisms that doesn't explain the bigger picture, you can get up and be like, well, at the end of this debate, it is just extraordinarily unclear why we care about any of the material that side negatives actually presented, because this, and this, and this. So like, almost like being like a doctor, like treating their case, being like, this is the fatal flaw in their case, and kind of diagnosing that is so useful, I think, because it resonates with judges if you're doing it on an analytical level, and it means they're more the debate to you than if you just give unstructured rebuttal that does the same thing but doesn't have that same coherent narrative. I think the final thing I do actually is really careful, not saying this is why we win, but just explain at every point the weighing metrics. So like our arguments. So the classic one is depth, how severe is the harm, breadth, how many people are affected, likelihood, how common is it going to happen? Is it going to happen every time, or is it unlikely? And then also importance. So is there a reason structurally why I should care about this group more than someone else? And I think I'd always do that really explicitly, because even if judges think it, they can be tentative that they're reading into the debate unless you say it explicitly. So if you say it explicitly, we're winning because our harms are more severe, affect more people, are more likely, and you explain the reasons for that, you're going to win, because they're going to regurgitate that to you in their way. Whereas if you don't do that, you might let the other team do it. You might leave it up to their personal interpretation. So I think it's the other thing I'd always do, just like at some point, spend 30 seconds to a minute, not in like 7:30, it'd be much earlier in the debate, at like, 6 minutes in. So we've won this issue because our harms are more important than these 3 reasons, and choose the thing that's the most important to explain that. That's kind of how I'd go about it.
Yeah, and often that very explicit engagement would happen probably around an introduction or one thing that I saw that was very, very effective is, I think it was one of the Sydney debaters, that during their split would always explain why they had chosen to break the debate in the way that they did, and within that integrate, it obviously took a little bit longer than some other ways of doing it, but integrate very clearly into it the ways in which each of the points that they're adding to the debate leads to the conclusion that they want the judge to draw, leads to the weighing metrics that we've talked about there. Any last things to say? Do you prefer BP or Australs? It's a fun question we often ask people on the Noise from the Bench.
I think Australs is the purest format. Yeah, I think that the deepest debates I've ever had have been in Australs format. I think you need to choose the right motion for it, but I think it's the purest analytical debating. And I think I personally found the third speaker speech to be a beautiful, beautiful beast. It's very, very difficult. It's very confronting, but it's a really enjoyable activity. And I think that it's an old-fashioned stout, and in BP, there's a lot of uncertainty. The motion can be unbalanced, and you have no selection capacities. You can be an OG that the other teams decide to gang up on, or you can be left alone, or you can be closing and the other team presents better arguments than you thought, so you're closed out, or they present nothing. All these things can happen. Whereas I feel that 3-on-3 is just an old-fashioned case versus case, team versus team, speaker versus speaker, rebuttal versus rebuttal. So I probably do enjoy 3-on-3 more.
There's nowhere to hide in 3v3. It's really the test of
exactly.
debating.
But I think that I found extensions in particular something that was intellectually fascinating in BP. So my answer is, generally speaking, I prefer 3-on-3, but there are parts of BP that I think are really rewarding and interesting that I enjoy doing. Yeah.
Nice, excellent. Any recommendations? Like what do you read? Because obviously a lot of what you did for heading into Australs was building your capacity to write excellent cases. What was your media intake before a tournament like that?
Yeah, so I'm, or as you probably expect, I'm big on the IR school. I think that IR is great because it helps every debate, because you think of new context, you decontextualize your mechs, because you don't just think about how it happens in inner city Melbourne, you think about how it happens anywhere, and it gives you more ideas. And also a lot of IR is about like what is happening in South Korea, and like a mech that's in a different context. It can just be international politics rather than international relations sort of stuff. So I would read in particular anything from the Council on Foreign Relations. Foreign Affairs is fantastic, although it can be biased.
I love Foreign Affairs. They're excellent.
Yeah, Foreign Affairs is great. I think World Politics Review is phenomenal for a general journalistic overview, but importantly is a lot of region-specific stuff. So I'd read The Diplomat for a lot of Asia stuff. I'd read Al Monitor for a lot of Middle Eastern politics stuff, looking at your regional newspapers that are owned by people who live in the region, who are from the region, and who write to the concerns of the region rather than from an external Western perspective is really useful, because you get a lot more insights as to how things actually work. I think a lot of Western scholarship can be crap on that sort of stuff. I think I would also finally keep abreast of a lot of academia. I think that's for two reasons. Firstly, AdCores are often older, so they might be more immersed in that sort of stuff. And I've literally seen debates that have been plucked straight out of academia before, and I've read the article, and it's like, fantastic, that's great. But also because they give you interesting new ideas and mechs. But that's kind of more of a longer term thing. I think directly in the lead up to Australs, you just want to be reading World Politics Review, Foreign Affairs. The Economist is good for a general overview, but don't overrate it. And then Council of Foreign Relations Backgrounders is probably the gold standard for understanding an issue. They go through a specific region, a specific conflict, a specific problem in a lot of depth. So that's a really good source too.
I think one problem that a lot of people have is there's just so much stuff to listen to, stuff to read. Do you do anything to help you absorb it, or is it really just you read, you expose yourself, and it generally just sinks in?
Cases. I think cases. So I think that what I would do a lot, and this is something that, Mish as well, so Mish is Harvard debater, but again, he was from UMelb. We would all do together, prepping for tournaments or thinking about them, would be to take insights from it and discuss them in debates. Like that's again where it's really discuss them amongst ourselves. So be like, how can I apply this mechanism to a debate? Talking to your teammate, talking to someone older, being like, hey, I had an idea about this. How do you think it could be applied? Or could you explain this? Or what do you think you can do here? That stuff's really useful. And doing like 15-minute preps with motions where you've just read something close to that topic and thinking about how you could integrate it. Because I think the biggest pitfalls of people read an Economist article yesterday and try to shoehorn it into every case today. That's actually a really delicate exercise. And I think that talking about it with your teammates, trialing it in practice, and thinking about the implications of what you can and can't do in an 8-minute speech is really, really useful too.
So New Zealand has a debating style called New Zealand Easters, or New Zealand Officers Cup, or New Zealand Impromptu Cup. And so it's a 5-minute preparation style with 6-minute speeches. And like, I personally love it as just like a warm up or a practice style, because you just go through so many different cases. You really start burning that like case generation, mech generation muscle. So the last thing I want to chat to you about just before I obviously let you go is what I really liked about what you'd mentioned about consuming media that's not just from a Western perspective is that a lot of people learn contexts and they learn mechanisms and they learn cases, but they don't really learn about preferences. They don't really learn about how people or particular groups construct the things that are meaningful to them. And one of the best bits of advice I got given for how to really impact points is to not just impact it through an objective lens, but specifically say why the people we think will be affected care about that particular thing or value that particular thing. What approach do you bring to impacting points? What are the steps you go through to make sure that they stick in the debate in a way that is meaningful, not just from a Western or a debater perspective?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I do when I coach, at least, is, and this is with school children, but very intelligent ones most of the time, is give them the list of cognitive biases and social biases and go have a read. This is every cognitive bias according to Wikipedia. What's the mech? And that's a really good way to think about it, because when you're thinking about conflict or short-termism or polarization, these are fundamentally these are behavioral mechanisms, and you're describing behavior. So I think the first thing is to do a lot of that psychological analysis, understand human behavior. And then the second thing that's really important to do is to explicitly think about when a mechanism would be different. So people talk about generically the developing world, which I personally am not a huge fan about. I prefer specificity, etc. But it might be like, for a pole side motion, how does electoral politics change in an ethnically fragmented society or a post-colonial society or a post-conflict society? And then you read up on those topics. So I think that there's no other way to do it generically, because you can use debate biases always, and you can link the context together, but then looking up, like, political system Kenya explained, and just reading about how that works and how that functions and what examples you can glean from it is a good thing in general, but specifically for the debating as well is really effective. I think that's my other answer is that if you think a mechanism might diverge in a different context, you shouldn't just speculate about it. You should actually actively Google it. And you can just, if you type explained in these days, most things are explained quite well. Not all, but most. So I think that's my answer. Yeah, look for the particular context and know the mechs really carefully. Because that really, really helps. And there are some classic things. So like, in a clientelistic society where there's a lot of corruption, mechs will change. When you live in a society that is ethnically fragmented, mechs will change. So you just need common examples, common mechanisms, analyze those things, and you can apply them quite well. Yeah.
Amazing. This was a lovely chat. It was so nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, even virtually.
Any final things for the people watching? Quite like a lot more people are watching this episode than the normal development seminars, but I will plug them. I think the development seminars are very good, and people should go back and look, especially if they're young.
That's nice to know, and that's good cross plug-in. Yeah, it's a tough time right now. In debating, obviously, in the world, particularly in the world, you have a lot of different things going on. But I think for those who are trying to, improve and get better, just keep trying at it. Worlds in particular is producing a lot of great resources. So we have our ads training, seminars, and other key lectures are being produced. And also always feel free to message me, even if you don't know who I am. I'm usually free to respond. I can give you some tips and tricks. And if you ever want me to talk through that kind of stuff like cases, I'm always happy to. And yeah, it's really good to see people who are keen about it and enjoy it and want to pursue the activity in a kind of enlightened intellectual sense. I think I really enjoy seeing that when people love making cases because they're interesting and fascinating rather than too routinized. So I think always try that. Always try to push the boundaries of how you construct cases, what claims you can and can't make, because that's when it's going to be more rewarding for you in the long term and more enjoyable.
Amazing. So I'll just quickly plug Horton Cup for our novice final is tonight. So if people want to watch that, come along. But other than that, I'll say goodbye.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
See ya.